We're going to bring in a political expert. We want to talk about things happening on the national landscape, specifically a deal just struck, hot off the press, as we were saying right before coming to air here, but a deal just struck to possibly avert a government shutdown. Meena Bose, she's the chair of presidential studies at Hofstra University. Hey, Meena, how are you?
I'm fine, Stephanie. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so can you kind of break this down, distill the issues so we can really understand it? There's a back and forth, and the backdrop of it is, tension that we've seen in this nation right now, specifically the backdrop being Minnesota, but we've seen it in this nation
Right.
related to immigration. And we heard a lot of back and forth. And I know there's other factors, but give us sort of the overview, and then we'll get into some specific questions here.
Sure. Well, of course, when we had the longest government shutdown in history last fall,
Mm-hmm.
that ended when there were temporary appropriations bills passed that were scheduled to expire on January 30th, which
Right.
is tomorrow. Up until last weekend, it seemed as though Congress was moving toward passing legislation to continue funding the government. On Saturday morning, after the fatal shooting in Minneapolis, a number of Democrats raised concerns about providing continued funding for Homeland Security and for, ICE has continued funding. Anyway, they decided to withdraw support. Now, the House passed legislation earlier this week, but the Senate, as of earlier today, did not seem to have the votes to bring a bill to the floor. They couldn't reach the threshold of 60, and actually some Republican senators joined with Democrats to oppose moving the bills forward. That changed just a few hours ago. There
Right.
appears to be an agreement to fund the legislation, fund agencies, and to have a 2-week extension for Homeland Security.
Yeah, so what I'm reading here from
Yep.
our news wires, Democrats and White House have struck a deal to avert a partial government shutdown and temporarily fund the Department of Homeland Security. So maybe that's the 2-week
Correct.
extension that you're referring to. So really the funds connected to DHS, which oversees, it's the overriding agency when it comes to ICE, Border Patrol,
Right.
et cetera. This was the problem, continuing to fund or not DHS, as we're
Correct.
seeing, and I talked about this a little earlier, Meena, you know this, the political implications of what's happening in the country right now with immigration are vast because there's so many sides. There's the right, there's the left, but then there's all that in between, all that gray area. It is definitely a hot button controversial issue. And so we're seeing it now in real time impact the government moving forward or not. And that's part of what is severe consequences.
Correct. And there are policy decisions that have to be made, and then there are government funding is kind of a crucial step in that process. I should just say that the House, if these new bills are passed by the Senate tomorrow, the House does have to pass them again, and will probably do so Monday. But
Mm-hmm.
because it's the weekend, there will likely be a minimal, if any, effect on this process.
Now, I want to ask you this question because you are the political expert. When we hear them say, to partially fund or temporarily fund or, temporarily struck a deal to partially fund, what they're basically saying is for the greater good, we're going to move forward, but they're not on the same page when it comes to all this stuff. I mean,
Correct. Right. If they were on the
100%,
same
right?
page, they would pass long-term legislation
Right,
for the rest of the year.
right,
Right. No,
right.
this is just to avoid another shutdown while discussions continue about a plan for the rest of this fiscal year, which ends September 30th.
And just to clarify, they're talking about different types of funding and different types of things, but it is when it comes to the DHS funding, that's where the specific holdup was. And it has to do with everything we've been talking about, including 2 Americans shot and killed, incidents connected to ICE. And we hear everybody in the nation basically weighing in on what happened, regardless of their
Right.
stance on this. We're looking at some video of a visual there, but it really is politically loaded, and we are seeing that play down in real time. As I said a short time ago, what are your thoughts on where they go from here?
Well, I think there are kind of two issues. I mean, there are multiple issues here, but there's the question of immigration reform and comprehensive policy making, and that's a pretty big task that's Washington has wrestled with at this point for decades. We
Hmm.
really haven't seen comprehensive reform since 1986.
Right.
1996 was more restrictive legislation, but there's also the immediate concern of just what you referenced, the two fatal shootings in Minneapolis this month. A lot of questions about the way immigrations and customs enforcement is finding people and taking them out of their homes. There have been questions about the tactics that have been done and responses to protesters. And so I would say that immigration is the underlying issue that will take some time to resolve. The question of what tactics ICE is using right now, and statements from the White House and from cabinet officials that have really kind of called into question what some of the facts were on the ground.
Interesting. We know the president does not want to shut down. He said earlier, right before we knew that this deal would probably lead to the aversion of a shutdown, president said we don't want to shut down. And we know that Republicans and the White House indicated an openness to separating the Homeland Security funding out of a larger spending bill. So basically, they wanted to kind of, I guess they were saying, let's just pull this apart so we can keep going and then we'll look at this later.
Exactly.
Now it seems like they've reached some kind of agreement, but again, there's more to see.
Well, it's essentially still the same thing, right?
Mhm.
They've pulled out one agency that will have 2-week funding. So
Right,
that will be the focus after the other bills are passed, right?
right.
So the government doesn't shut down, but this one issue really, it's another 14 days,
It's
right?
another
Now we're
14
looking at the
days. So
middle
we're
of
going to be right
February.
back here if they don't make significant movement one way or another. And it's hard to imagine that.
Indeed.
I mean, 14 days is a very short window. As of course, I'm just, I guess, stating the obvious. We see the narrative so far apart. Even if you look at the way the federal government and the people who spoke on behalf of the feds and the local government on the ground there in Minnesota kind of address the public, two very different narratives, respectively. What I'm talking about, the two shooting incidents, we saw two different narratives. So you see the polarization of the issue. So when you think about 2 weeks from now, I mean, where are we really going to be?
Well, that's kind of the key question. I think there's what happened in Minneapolis, and there's kind of a process underway, though some of those efforts for state investigations have been stymied um, from the federal government at this time. There's also the question of what to do, what Congress will decide about the agency, about
Mm-hmm.
DHS, and that could well depend upon if certain officials are still in place in 2 weeks, if certain agreements are made between the White House and Congress about how to move forward with perhaps some changes in approach. Those are the types of questions that will have to be addressed. And so, again, it's kind of what's happening on the ground. And then I would say larger questions about decision making and guidance and, above all, funding from Washington.
We've seen a lot of national headlines lately, not just as it relates to immigration enforcement, but just many different issues. And, you hear colloquially anyway, a lot of people saying, the country's very divided right now. In terms of your expertise, I mean, is this just kind of different narrative, but history repeating itself? I mean, when did governments really ever just always see eye to eye? You know what I mean? This is why the dialogue exists. Or do you think there is an extreme polarization in the country, unlike what you've seen before? What's your take on what's happening on the federal level?
Well, I mean, I would say that we're in a period of I wouldn't say it's at least in recent history unprecedented divisiveness between the two political
Mm-hmm.
parties. Um, Governance in Washington, even with unified government, right? It's very difficult to move forward. Bipartisanship has all but disappeared in major areas, and so it's kind of it's difficult to see what the path forward is. Um, if the electoral process is respected and followed, then we'll see what elections bring with the midterms and then how that affects policymaking. But I would say, Stephanie, it may not be completely unprecedented, but
Mhm.
it's hard to find a parallel in recent memory, certainly in the last 50 years.
And again, your expertise, has to do with politics and the play out, but you're talking about just we are seeing a lot of unprecedented things. And I think, I don't know what your take is on this, but it's also exasperated, so to speak, or maybe we're just more in touch with what's happening because of social media. So we see it even, I mean, I could speak as a journalist from
Yeah.
the news side. You see one individual incident, all of a sudden there's video that goes viral, right? But when we see what's playing out in politics on the federal level, I mean, information, it's just out there as soon as it happens, like never before. And so a lot of people are tapped into the political narrative right now.
Sure. Well, it's very easy to spread information very quickly and also misinformation.
Right?
So you have a lot of, right, videos, you have altered videos, you have questions. So you have narratives and counter narratives. But yes, absolutely, people can see what's happening. So it's very difficult for any one group or individual to try to control the narrative. And ultimately, when that information is out, that allows people to make a full assessment of what events are happening and what's being said. And I think that's, as this is the semi-quincentennial year of the Declaration of Independence, right?
Right.
It's a very timely moment to kind of think about what our founding principles and goals are as a country
You, you,
and where we go forward.
It's interesting that you say that because it's something we're hearing again and again. I feel like that discourse is trending. A lot of people tapped into the dialogue that, there is this division in the nation and there are all these perspectives. I want to ask when you hear, I asked you at the beginning of our interview live here to kind of distill this major headline. Is it too simplistic to say that immigration is a major divisive issue and decisive issue, either way, in the nation
Yeah.
right now, but that the polarization of it has really potentially led to the government shutting down? I mean, I know that there was more in there, but that's kind of the headline. And when you're reading it, I even took a step back, and I've covered immigration for years. I was like, wait a sec, that's a big headline. I mean, if you think about what we're really talking about.
Right. Well, I think without a doubt, I mean, immigration is connected to so many other issues with the economy, with foreign policy, with jobs, with questions of education,
Yeah.
opportunities. And I think that ultimately addressing, kind of creating some sort of comprehensive immigration policy, which will require both political parties to work together and the public to kind of find areas of agreement is really kind of essential to moving forward as a country. But it's difficult to say what that path will be. No one side can say it's my way or we're not going forward. That's just continues what we've been doing for too long already.
100%. And the government, everybody that makes up the entity needs to ultimately work together. We know the president and the administration's position on immigration, but we also know that there is pushback from Democrats. Even some moderates have some kind of pushback. It's interesting to see what's happening on the ground right now. But I think that it's just a snapshot of what's really been happening over the last year or so since the president stepped back into the Oval Office. It's almost like we've been watching a snowball effect, so to speak.
Right. Well, and of course, I mean, there have been kind of ebbs and flows. I mean, really, you could date this back to early in the 21st century when former President George W. Bush proposed creating a guest worker program. That
Mm-hmm.
didn't go anywhere. But that was one suggestion. There have been proposals for the DREAM Act, right?
Mm-hmm.
Deferred relief for children who were brought into this country. President Obama put in DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals. That was an executive action. That's not legislation, right? And so we've seen multiple efforts. We saw the government shutdown in 2018 over the wall. That was in the first Trump term. We
We
saw
did. Yes, I forgot about that. Mm-hmm.
right in the pandemic, the restrictions at the border, and then when those were lifted,
Yep.
the surge in efforts to enter the United States at the border in the last 2 years of the Biden administration. So immigration has gone through multiple cycles just in the 21st century, and it's kind of all of this has to be brought together: the border, paths to legal entry, visa status, opportunities for international students. There's a lot families,
There's
right?
a
How do
lot
you
of
bring
history
families
here.
together?
There's a lot of history,
Right.
what I'm hearing you say. And I
And a
think
lot
it's
of action.
also
Yep.
important to note, and you're making the distinction that the President Trump is certainly not the only US president to crack down on immigration, to push or pull back on what's happened with immigration or people entering the country illegally. But I do think, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this as we tie this all up, the narrative, there's so many people tapped into the narrative. And I think we are at a turning point where it's like, okay, this is what's happened, as you noted. So what's to come next? That what's to come next is in our face every day when there's another, major headline that we're covering here in the newsroom. But I think, again, the public is very tapped in, plugged into this. And we have to note that there are a lot of people who said, the President Trump did what he had to do at the borders because the borders were overflowing. We've heard that narrative.
Well, but there are two parts to it. There's the border, and then there's what's been happening internally in
Right.
cities, right? And the deportations of people in the United States, many with some form of protected status
Mm-hmm.
or had previously had an opportunity that they were seeking legal status, are suddenly, right, being put on a plane and appearing for a court session, and then suddenly they're being deported.
Mm-hmm.
There have been mistakes made. There has been a much more aggressive effort in the past year than we've seen previously to remove people who have been in the United States, who may not have fully legal status, but have been on the pathway to get some. And there have been some errors as well.
Yeah.
Some pretty serious ones.
I think it's interesting because as we talk about the border, sometimes the border is too simplistic of a term, I think. And I think, you're noting that. But I think when we look at the derivative of it, it's, whether you've come here seeking asylum or whatever your individual situation may be. Sometimes we know that, I've interviewed so many immigration attorneys where it's like you're locked or you're within a process, right? And I think that's what you're talking about. There's some kind of a process, and then we're seeing deportations. But ultimately, we know that the majority of people who have come into the country illegally have crossed the border. I mean, it's typically the southern border, but I've even reported on crossings along the northern border. So we've seen that.
Right.
There's also, you can cross border by air. I think sometimes we forget that. There's a lot to the narrative. And I think sometimes when we talk about this, we do refer to simplistic terms. It's like, what can we digest?
Right. And I think, there are kind of two parts, right? There are the border crossings, and those have declined dramatically in the first year of the second Trump term.
100%.
But the internal efforts to remove people who have been in this country who may not have fully legal status or were in the process of acquiring it, that has been a dramatic increase. There's been some reporting on this in the past few weeks.
That's the unprecedented component that you're referring to. And that's where we're seeing so much dialogue, so much narrative lock in. And that's what brings us back to what we're talking about, even to be able to discuss with you tonight, the potential of a government shutdown over funding for DHS. Definitely something we haven't seen before in history. You said you can't remember something like this.
Not in recent memory,
right?
So, and certainly not over this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure. Yeah. I get it. You have like those files in your head, and then sometimes you're referring to the. Do you refer to the text still by hand? Because I use text still, but whatever. However you're researching.
Exactly. No, exactly. I mean, hopefully we're not approaching a civil war, right? Those are the parallels that are made, and that's you have to be careful of what you say here. I don't think we're at that level of sectional conflict,
right?
But the divisions are pretty sharp, and I will say that there is not a lot of rhetoric from Washington that is coming to try to tamp down that to approach bipartisan deliberation and consensus, and that makes it harder.
I did read though that we are hearing the administration say that it wants to kind of diffuse a bit what's happening on the ground right now. I think it's one of those things, once the storm starts, how far can we pull back? And, when you look at any democracy, there's the right to protest. You got to think some differences is part of the democratic process. But then, there's that fine line. And like you said, it is a very sensitive time. I think you're very smart to say we got to be careful what we say, all of us, and mindful of our words and really vetting that information that goes out there. I know I'm certainly doing that as a journalist because this is so politically loaded, which is why we had a political expert on tonight.
Well, you're very kind. I would say the burden is higher for us, in the media, in academia. And I would say it's even higher for public officials who have the biggest platform, to communicate accurately and to try to calm tensions, not foment them.
Hey, Meena, before I let you go, I just kind of want to tie this up in a bow. Hearing, though, that at least for now, you said 2 weeks, but at least for now, a shutdown is diverted, or, you know, we don't have to worry about that just yet, or maybe there's some hope of a resolution. That is good news for the nation. We do not want a shutdown.
Correct. I 100%. A shutdown does not benefit anyone. It slows down, right, policy making, day-to-day activities that are needed. There's a point, I think, that advocates of a shutdown are trying to make, and I think that has been effective.
Right.
We'll see what kind of the response is on the ground, and then what the larger kind of agency decisions are. But sometimes you need to put that pressure to reach a decision that, you know, pursues the public interest.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, like sometimes it's used as a tactic to kind of find some kind of middle ground, right? We see that all the time happening in politics. Yeah, good point.
Right. Very nature of American democracy.
Meena Bose, chair of presidential studies at Hofstra University. Thank you for being with us tonight. We appreciate you.